Ahojte moji milí štvrtáci, ja vás pozdravujem z hodiny ďalšej, ktorú máme. Čím ďalej, tým viac dopredu nahrávam vaše hodiny. Stále využívam chvíľku, keď akurát v tejto chvíli nemám čo opravovať, tak si vyrábam materiály a robím dopredu hodiny. Samozrejme, už to bude ten týždeň, keď už máte túto hodinu, tak už to bude úplne inak. Ja mám ešte 14, vy budete mať 22 alebo 23 už v tom období, či viac ako týždeň po. A dúfam, že už nemáte takéto krásne počasie ako my dnes v Štiavnici, stále to neroztopilo, ale už to u vás kvitne zelená aj u nás, hádam. Dobre, to je pohľad z nášho okna. Ja to môžem zavrieť, aby sa trošku ľahšil môj počítač, lebo má trošku problém, že naraz robí milión vecí, čiže naťahujem ďalšie video pre druhákov. No, čo môžem ďalšie zavrieť je, je Facebooková skupina, viete, už Michal odchádza, určite 4. hodinu teraz mám tento deň. Čiže odpovedajte na otázky, ktoré som vám zadal, netuším ešte, čo sa spýtam, ale minule to bolo celkom fajn, teda ešte minulý predtým týždeň, čiže o rôznych témach, ktoré sme mali a článkoch, ktoré čítate, takže budem sa asi pýtať na rôzne krajiny, štáty sveta a čo sa asi vo svete deje. Dobre, toto nám ešte 15 minút zostáva a v podstate toto je ešte dnešný môj deň. No, ja sa pokúsim pokračovať ďalej. Dúfam, že mi prezentácia nebude haprovať ako pred chvíľou. Je obrovská, hej, má tých 81 slajdov, tam množstvo obrázkov, takže takto sa presne PowerPoint nemá robiť. Čo sa však má robiť je, že máte urobiť výcuc, no a v tomto výcuce nezabudnite, že odpovede alebo rozpísané to máte v tých wordových poznámkach. Ja vám ich už nejdem ukazovať, čiže ja pôjdem normálne ďalej a pôjdeme ďalej, čo tam máme. So, going back to the previous lesson, we talked about the end of the Cold War, the timeline, and also about decolonization process, which I explained what was that. And I started with one of the countries, and it's communist China. For many other countries we picked up, we are going to deal with them today further, and one by one we will analyze them. I mean the most important ones. At least we mention some of major conflicts and proxy wars as a part of decolonization process. When we talk about China, definitely we needed to mention even Korea and Vietnam. Korea will be mentioned more specifically in here, but as you see, only a couple of information you need to know. But that was first major war just 1 year after Soviet Union seized managed to construct the A-bombs. Still, they were not the participants of this conflict, and surprisingly, they didn't support communist North Korea. If you remember, that was also case how the Red Army, Soviet Army, invaded Japanese occupied territories of China and Korea, and thus they helped communist resistance after the war. So what happened in Korea, just like in Vietnam, most of the northern territories were dominated by communists and south by Democrats or nationalists under the protection of USA. What happened that after China prevailed, won the Communist Party, so North Korean communists that were motivated and supported by Chinese, they also wanted to claim whole Korea for them. So in 1950 they invaded at the time border between these two parts of the country, and they just invaded it. South Koreans, they asked USA for help, and USA now scared that how China was quickly lost without their help, and only Taiwan was saved, and Hong Kong. So they didn't want to do this. Like, China was the first figure of domino, and they're going to push the others, and all the figures will fall down. So in this way they wanted to stop it, and this is Truman Doctrine in practice. So for that reason they asked the Security Council of United Nations to approve, to give permit for invasion to Korea against North Korean communists. This was actually surprisingly supported by Soviet Union too, and for that reason, United Nations proclaimed that the aggressor is North Korea. That's why about 20 countries, more countries joined USA. Some of the biggest troops were of Australian, New Zealandese, and from Greece, because Greece wanted to show kind of gratitude for help and civil war in 1947-1948 against communists. So Greece remained capitalistic and thus democratic, of contrary how to say sometimes, but they remained democratic, and they also sent a lot of soldiers to Korea. So at the time, Soviet Union was kind of in conflict with China, didn't mind very much these things, and only later on they proved that they stood on the side of North Korea. Still, neither China nor Soviet Union were strong enough to challenge US forces. Definitely, I should have added some picture or a scene from famous comedy TV series MASH, because it's the plot is and settings is in this Korean War. Despite the TV series were shot during the Vietnam War, and they criticized Vietnam War while depicting Korean War. Despite Korean War was much more easier to set who was good and who was the bad guy. What happened? Now United Nations and American forces embanked near Busan, that you may know as famous port town, and they pushed communists back, deliberated Seoul, the capital of South Korea. And actually the invasion was so successful that within a couple of months they pushed communists almost to Yalu River, which was the border between China and North Korea. But the winter came, and even at the time these forces were not ready for this winter war. But what happened was intervention of China. China didn't want to let their comrades in North Korea to fall. So not only they supported South North Koreans, but actually they invaded. They sent whole Chinese People's Army to fight. And now invasion of huge Chinese army, and for the first time two superpowers, but still China was not so strong at the time, but still like huge, challenge Americans to fight. And now what happened? For upcoming 2.5 years, none of fighting sides, American and United Nations side and North Korean and Chinese, were able to prevail, and the front line was moving around the capital of Seoul. Seoul as the capital of South Korea. For 2.5 years, nothing could move, and MASH that lasted much longer than Korean War, actually showing the depressy, losing of hope, loss of hope of the protagonists, that the war is useless because they are just killing, and there is no point whether somebody is communist or Democrat or whatever, that some good people are on both sides and bad people on the other side too. So it was kind of anti-war pacifistic like manifest, this TV series, and the result was that just days after the major character went mad, he pretended like in the at 22 famous novel was said that armistice was proclaimed. Armistice was set up by United Nations, and it was accepted that only like why we are fighting, there is no point in it. So let's accept that there are two Koreas, South Korea, that is called the Republic of Korea, that is democratic, capitalistic, like free market, and North Korea, which is called Korean People's Democratic Republic, beautiful name but terrible regime, in which they are still all the time only armistice. So officially there is still war between these two countries, but there is only temporary armistice that lasts for more than almost 70 years, like in 2 years almost. The border was set according to 38th parallel, which is today one of the most militarized zones and almost unpenetrable. Despite of that, some people, thousands of people, managed to escape to South Korea. While North Korea today, this dictator is from the family of Kim's family, very often asking for food, probably suffering some famine and hunger strikes, help from China or from Russia or United Nations, but they don't want to accept it, so they shoot out some missiles. While South Korea, or Democratic Republic of Korea, is one of the richest, most productive countries in the world, one of so-called Asian tigers, with famous car factories, Kia, Hyundai, also with some factories around the world, just like in Jilina, and also very sporty nation today. Okay, what else? That was one of many conflicts that was showing kind of a system that local authorities, local nations try to deliberate themselves from the oppression and influence of these colonial powers. Because this was case of China, that was a bit different from the others. I divided later on other countries according to former colonial countries, because when I mention British or Portuguese or French colonies, you know that probably you can use this language even today, that those people, apart from their native languages, they also have their colonial languages, their communication. This is case of British Commonwealth. As you know, British Commonwealth was established in times of English Republic in 17th century by Oliver Cromwell, but further on it remained like the name for British Empire. They didn't want to call it like this, but it was. Empire still for many countries that remained bounded to United Kingdom. For example, not only with wearing these Union Jacks in their flags, but also it kind of bound things to politics, to economy, especially to military. So they remain part of what we call the British Commonwealth, that is specific organization of countries of United Kingdom of Great Britain and their former colonies, still keeping like good relationships, which English realize or the British realize is probably better way to give independence to the country than to fight them, and rarely they had to fight. But what English or the British wanted to do was not to leave country to communist easy and like too easy bait or weak for any dictators and so on. So not only to fight communists like Americans, but at the same time also to help to build democratic institutions within the country. And until the time, by the time they didn't get it, they didn't make it, so they didn't give them independence, which of course caused some conflicts. But in case of two countries of India and Israel that I'm going to explain, will be different. But other countries like Canada, Australia, many countries in Africa were giving independence very quickly and soon after, even despite these democratic institutions were not set up properly as we would like to imagine, because of the history or ethnic or religious structure of the countries around. But all these countries in red, where British remain parts of British Commonwealth, remain bounded in here, and still England, like the United Kingdom, still have a couple of islands in Caribbean islands or in Gibraltar, for example, near Spain, or Falklands and South Georgia, for example, so-called the Malvins Islands, or a couple of islands in the Pacific Ocean. Okay, so let's analyze one by one, especially these ones: South Africa, then India and Israel. So let's analyze them. First, let's speak about India. India is one of the ancient countries. Last time we mentioned it, I think it was during the Age of Discoveries. If you remember, when Portuguese came there, they didn't bring anything valuable for Indians. So India also supposed themselves like superior country. If you remember that in British actually overruled India thanks to one good strategy. Not like French, they wanted to occupy it, but they picked up some important rajas, the princes and kings, and they offered them alliance. That, let's say, Raja of some part would just pay all of loyalty to the king of Britain, but he will have actually independence, and he will be supported with the guns, with weapons and power all around. So in this way, I got a doggy in here. Okay, so the dog is here. Okay, she can wave on you guys. So about time, if you don't mind, she'll be here in the end. But it's Chihuahua, so different, something different. Okay, so the point was that India was divided among the Indians who were loyal to the Britain and those who were fighting for independence. So those who had some advantages, so they supported them within like during 19th century resistance for wars, but also during First or Second World War too. Indians were really loyal, and this loyalty of Indians made British feel responsible for the good fortune and good future of India. So actually many of Indian soldiers were fighting Germans or Japanese only in order to be given independence for British, as because British felt kind of like honor, and so they should like fulfill the promises in here. So this led that they start to proclaim, okay, India will be given independence. And when? in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. Another war came, and other Indians were dying for British crown, and still they didn't have independence. So for that reason, the couple of personalities appeared who started to establish political bodies, self-representative assemblies that would speak up for all the India and manage to claim the independence movement for India. Among them, the most famous was this guy, Mohandas Gandhi, that got a nickname called Mahatma, which is in Hindu language, it means the great spirit. So Mohandas Mahatma Gandhi was actually a lawyer, studied at Oxford University. He was from very rich Indian family that was from these highest castas, and he had like excellent education. You wouldn't say that, but actually his early pictures from his youth, he's like wearing blazer and tie or bow tie and glasses and studying. Actually, glasses were the only thing that remained. But during his studies and then his teaching practice was in South Africa. Actually, many Indians found their fortune when they moved to Africa as very hardworking, skilled, and educated people. They opened a lot of small businesses. They were tailors, teachers, lawyers. And in this way, Mahatma Gandhi, he came to South Africa to become a lawyer. And while the studies, when he saw also ethnic injustice, segregation in South Africa, he started to be sorry that not only Indians but anybody in the world deserve independence, freedom, and he picked up some things from Hinduism, something from Buddhism, started wearing these simple clothes like Hinduistic ascetic priest, and at the same time he installed ideas of American not playwright, but novel writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote among many other books of naturalism, he wrote in 19th century. He wrote the book Walden, or Life in the Woods. It was a short, small book, short novel, which was kind of autobiographical notes, a diary about his life in a small cabin, log cabin by the lake somewhere in Pennsylvania or somewhere. He was living there like a hermit, like ascetic guy. And during this time, he was praising like nature and like hiking around and living together with nature in harmony with nature and the world and respect to any living creatures. And these ideas of American naturalism matched together with Buddhism and positive Hinduism led him to the ideas what Ralph Waldo Emerson proposed at the end. If this naturally, if we want to protect nature, we had to stand against industry, against Saruman. Yeah. So this is something that, but how can we fight with war, with violence? No. One thing that it's actually the same weapon. It's the same thing for industry and decline of the soul of humanity within a man or woman. And in this way, a good way how to resist oppressive regime that you have to because you should be responsible citizen is to use civic disobedience, not to obey some bad decisions that are immoral, unethical. You have to stand against the state. You had to stand against oppression. You have to protect poor people and those who are disadvantaged. But how to fight them? Not paying taxes. He recommended to Indians, why are you paying taxes to Britain when they promised us to have independence? Stop paying taxes and there will be no point in here. The second thing is, which is very important for Buddhism and even this Ralph Waldo Emerson disobedience, civic disobedience, občianská neposlušnosť, is to protest, to demonstrate in peaceful way. When you go out to the streets with transparents and shouting some claims, some words, you should not attack police. You should sit down, let them be violent. Because then, when they use violence, British Army, these peaceful marches, very often they turn out to riots that we know from America, into fights with the police, with cops. But if you sit down, if you bound yourself to the tree, if you protest with music, for example, and you do no harm to the other people, they didn't want to. The police, they didn't want to. Some of them they actually joined them. But what is more important, if they use violence and the news and media depicts like you are being beaten, like during Velvet Revolution, you are being the one imprisoned, you are being the killed. that then moral right is on your side. So even anytime you will be trying to change the things, this is one of the most powerful things. Despite it can last for many years. For India, it lasted only like 3, 4 years to seize independence. But for, let's say, dissidents in socialist countries, Václav Havel and plastic people of the universe, Alexander Solzhenitsyn that I mentioned, they had these Gandhi ideas about non-violence, about criticism only in books, not in organizing in military. There is one specific thing I will tell you in Czechoslovakia, Biela Legia. Yesterday there was one anniversary of Akcia K about destroying these monasteries, and they mentioned White Legion. But these guys, and any historian can tell you, but these guys were fascists, members of Hitler Jugend of Hlinková Mládež. So probably, moral right is not always on your side. Of course, sometimes there are no other means, only to fight with weapons. But this is nice one, and actually very effective to gain this. Okay, doggy, go home. Okay, so she refuses. Refuses. Okay, so what happened? So this policy of civic disobedience and non-violence made Mahatma Gandhi one of the most famous people of mid 1940s, fighting for independence of India in peaceful way. The problem started that there was another people, other politicians in so-called Indian National Congress. That was an assembly of representatives from many states of India all around. Many of them came from regions that were settled in green color by Muslims, the other from Buddhists in this yellow, and most of them were Hindus. Some were peaceful, just like Gandhi and his followers. Some were more, how to say, conservative and willing to divide India according to ethnic, especially religious borders. And that was the other guy sitting in here, Jawaharlal Nehru. Jawaharlal Nehru represented these things when Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in 1948 by, try to guess by whom? By radical Hinduists, because it did like opinion of Gandhi that India should be kept together and should respect other religions, which radical Hindus refuse, just like radical Muslims refuse other religions, radical Christians refuse other religions. So this happened the same thing. Many people who were assassinated in this way were assassinated by their own people because they were not radical enough, not pure. They are willing to make compromise with their enemy. They believe to be other religion to be the enemies. Thus, in this way, after the death of Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru became the head of Indian National Congress, Indický národní Congress. And finally, they managed to negotiate independence of India in 1947 with Britain. Britain, realizing that many religious problems appearing, so they actually refused to help Indians more, that only accept that if you have Supreme Court, if you have Parliament, and if you have government, and if you have free election for everybody, we leave India. So India was proclaimed as republic, as the biggest democracy in the world. The biggest country is China, but they don't keep elections. In India, you have the biggest democratic free elections in the world. They last for 1 month. It takes for all the people, 1 billion Indians, to come to vote and to count all the tickets, all the voting tickets. So in this way, appeared another problem, and in this way, because of course election that would be held and that were had been held, let's say in parts of Burma or Bangladesh or Pakistan, that was still India at the time. So they're completely different political parties, and that's why Jawaharlal Nehru accepted that India should be divided. Britain proclaimed only some like basic borders, but they were not exact, and they told them to make accepting like some agreement, like decide how you will exchange population or how you will respect the other's rights. When politicians and Nehru said that, yeah, we will accept it. So again, the radical Hindus refused that. So do you know what they started doing? They started burning down villages, killing Hindu people, Muslims in India, in Bangladesh, so on. In Pakistan, when they heard that Hindus are killing Muslims, so they started killing Hinduists. And on both sides, terrible atrocities caused millions of lives of civilians. And these moments during the division of India, partition of India, caused such terrible hate that probably there is no such similar hate anywhere in the world. Check out over the YouTube national anthem of Pakistan or India. You will see thousands of commentaries from both countries telling about swines and bad words and offending, insulting both nations. That our, like, I don't know, not friendship with the Hungarians, it's nothing compared to them. That led that both of the countries, India and Pakistan, as two biggest, were actually became part of fighting blocs, despite officially being like neutral. But Pakistan became kind of ally of United States, and India of Soviet Union, and Soviets offered a bomb technology to India, which they made. And immediately USA scared, come on, what if India becomes communist? So we have to give a bombs to Pakistan to keep the balance. And thus America gave A bombs to Pakistan. Suddenly, you have two radical countries, one Hinduistic, the other Muslim, with A bombs, which of course caused that Americans are really aware of Pakistan until by the end of the Cold War, and since that time they didn't care much about it. Suddenly, Osama bin Laden was hiding in Pakistan. India, despite of like leftist thinking and the solidarity, they proved to be still democratic, still open market, still helping poor, which are millions, hundreds of millions of them, and still very big inequality. India is slowly struggling to keep better. Communists would say that probably India would be better, but they understood that British anyway, they gave them a lot of chances to live within democracy that is still better in here. So that's why many Pakistani people or Indians move even to United Kingdom. So you can see in Harry Potter, girls with this Indian color, of skin. You see 10 million Pakistani people living in there. Freddie Mercury from the band Queen at the beginning of his career was still like offended by guys in the crowd like he's Paki, and that was a bad word, offense for Pakistani people. Still, anyway, he was from Zanzibar, not from Pakistan. That is completely different thing. That was not only like Pakistan and India, but also there were today it's like 200 million or 180, I don't know, about millions of people in Bangladesh that is Muslim, soon to be flooded because of climate changes, and that can be really dramatic changes and source of conflict, possible conflict in around in here. Still fighting for some lands in Kashmir, even with China, Pakistan, and India that I had mentioned before. And here in Burma and partially Thailand, uh, this country is called Myanmar today. Myanmar was Buddhist, but also experienced a couple of regimes that were not very authoritative or communist. The last island was island of Ceylon, that is called Sri Lanka, and it got population divided in three parts in Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims. Three countries, three parts fighting for power. One of the longest civil war in the world, and even probably the only Buddhist terrorist groups ever. Against them, there was another Hinduistic called the Tigers of the Deliberation of Tamil Elam, and it was really infamous in 1980s and 90s. Okay, let's move on to another country that is in here. I believe I can move the flag. Yeah, like this. So you can see it through my head. I mentioned South Africa among the countries. Its history is different because originally this was settled by Portuguese, but soon they were banished by the Dutch. And the Dutch, they didn't have enough lands to work on to farm. So many, like actually hundreds of thousands of Dutch settlers, which in Dutch ancient language it's called boer, which means farmer or a peasant, settled in South Africa. Since they lived here for like 400 years, these Dutch settlers started to speak language that was mixture of Dutch, of English, and of local Zulu and Bantu languages. Zulu and Bantu are two dominant African original tribes living in South Africa. But together, this mixture created language of these white Dutch settlers called Afrikaan. And when you listen to it, if you, if you can't imagine what is that, listen to the Antwoord. If you know this dance floor band, electronic band, so they sing in Africa. They are from South Africa. These Dutch settlers were actually challenged by British Empire at the end of the 19th century, when British Empire decided to occupy this part of the land that is called the Cape Colony, Albocapska Colonia, according to Cape of Good Hope or Cape Town, and it actually was all this part of the land. Uh, Still, Boers, because they didn't like this British rule, because at the time Britain, for example, forbade the racial segregation, which they had all around. So they just moved to inlands and established three states which were in here, and that was Transvaal and a Free Orange state. Both of them having this Dutch heritage of Oranges and of Transvaal, that is African or Dutch name like Záhory alebo medzi údolie. Transvaal. Both of these states were created in the way they just banished local Zulu tribes, killed them out, and occupied these lands, start farming. As the hard-working colonists, they soon made these lands prosperous, but still, again, they were challenged by British, who tried to unite them in so-called South African Union. And now, in the end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, British army had to fight against this partisan Boer warfare. Boers wars were typical for that. That Boers were supported by Germany, by Imperial Germany, giving them guns, weapons, and so on. And even British army was not able to resist in partisan warfare with local dedicated partisans and so on. So British had no other possibility than to oppress them and oppress civilian support of them. For that reason, British Empire established first infamous concentration camps after the Civil War, in which not soldiers but civilians were stored. Families of these Boer partisans were stored there, and finally, that made the Boers lost support from civilians, from their families and farmers, and also they tried to save their lives. So they actually resisted and accepted to entering the British Commonwealth. On the other hand, they asked British to keep their way of life. It means segregation, and it became famous. Again, South Africans became loyal in both world wars. So during the Cold War, especially when countries like Angola or Mozambique were ruled by communists, so South Africa, despite being racist, segregated country ruled by white Boers, so for them, it was great ally for Britain and US both, because they all the time invaded, bombed, and fought communists anywhere in South Africa. For that reason, this racist policy of segregation of black population from the whites, called apartheid, was accepted by USA and UK for all the Cold War, and it ended up already in early 1990s. When I was a little kid, I remember 1980s in communist TV news that Nelson Mandela and their African National Congress, that was established similarly as example compared to Indian National Congress. So they established, but their actually leaders are all of them imprisoned. Václav Havel spent in prison in communist penitentiary like a couple of years, but Nelson Mandela spent 40 years in prison of apartheid South Africa. One of the guys who was inspired by this civic disobedience and non-violence of Mahatma Gandhi, some of them actually met with him, so they start to call for the changes. But what changed this racist policy? That I can remember, small boy, that South Africa was one of the examples that how democratic and capitalistic country are actually supporting racism. Don't be surprised today, but it's still there in many of these countries. Later on, when Cold War was coming to the end, even Boers realized that probably this African policy of apartheid should end it. So they released Nelson Mandela from the prison, and they allowed him to go freely. But it caused a lot of conflicts around. But Africans or Boers were not, how to say, didn't feel strong enough to challenge all the black population. So especially when the bishop Desmond Tutu, one of famous leaders of African National Congress, started to call, and the Pope John Paul II Wojtyla visited South Africa, and it was already early 1990s. Soviet bloc was falling. So that was time that even South Africa should change. So finally, even Afrikaans Boers accepted their policy should change. And as at the end of the Cold War, they elected new president of South African Union, Frederick de Klerk, this guy, as new president, who his program was to make peace with Africans, with Zulus and Bantus, with Africans, and offer them peace and kind of like agreement, which thanks God for them, for South Africa, that Nelson Mandela was willing to forgive all these things like Strand am Zee met Blankes, beach and sea whites only, segregated Johannesburg, beautiful modern town and with slums around, terrible segregation, no education, no access to social things, to electricity, to water, no access to the riches of South Africa, one of the greatest countries with resources in the world, and living in slums like anywhere, like in Liberia, Nigeria. For that reason, they accepted to create free elections, which obviously were won by Nelson Mandela's African National Congress. And since 1990, South Africa officially proclaimed democracy in their country, not of communism but of apartheid. Their new flag, as you can see, was flag of combination of the Dutch history and of African colors together, and that is the Union. I was really surprised when in 1994-6 South Africa was picked up to be the hosting country for World Championship in football in 2010, which that made me really happy. Believe that Africa can rise again if they make like peace with among races, among nationalities and tribes and so on. Still high unemployment, very high rate of crime, but still getting slowly better and better. The pics that Slovakia was playing in 2010 in South Africa, and you could see people, white people, black people, brown and mixed, sitting and playing these terrible vuvuzelas, trumpets, but having together. First time actually I saw it already in 1996 was in Rugby World Cup, in which you had all these guys, white like British, black like these Africans, mixed Indians, in one rugby team fighting together against New Zealand or England, for example. So that was interesting story, but still high rate of criminality, crime in there. So we'll see what future brings for South Africa. Okay, I shall check up the time. Okay, 24, 23 minutes, which is pretty enough for me for another country and a much more difficult story about Arab and Israeli conflict. This is also part of British Commonwealth because Jordan, Palestine was given as a mandatory territory from the former Ottoman Empire to the British Mandate. And if you remember, I told you stories how British tried to persuade Americans to join First World War, and among the lobbying groups were also Jews from Wall Street, bankers and merchants and entrepreneurs. And as a promise for this entering USA to war, British should be given this part of Ottoman Empire, and they promised to create in these Arabic Palestine territories around Jerusalem legendary ancient civilization of Israel to create their new state of Israel, which was happened. And during this First World War, it really happened. So of course, it became known as Zionism. That Jews will actually build up their new state somewhere around Israel, which made many of nationalistic groups to move here in these times. The problem was that they were not officially allowed. If you remember, I told you that British firstly wanted to build up these political institutions and let be first to build up democracy in this country and then to give them independence, which was not very possible when many of these nationalistic Jews were coming in here. The problem started when in 1930s Adolf Hitler started with Holocaust in Germany. Millions and thousands of Jews were escaping from Germany, and many of them coming here to this British territory of Palestine. Many of them had this Zionistic nationalistic view, so when they built some villages, they usually banished Arabic neighbors. If they didn't want to leave, they built up terrorist organization called Irgun, and they start to organize terrorist attacks against Arab Palestinian Arabs. This was the first terrorist group that was Jewish, actually. Later on, more and more people, Jews from other version that is more leftist, more democratic, called Hapoel. Actually, if you know football a bit, there are every Israeli town had two football clubs, Hapoel and Beitar. They are both named according to physical organizations, sport organizations that are at the same time military. Niečo ako u nás bol, ako som rozprával o telovýchovnej jednote Sokol, tak podobné mali Židia. Bejtars were actually the Zionist nationalists who were actually very close to fascism. Italian Mussolini, for example, they admired them and they helped them very often. There is one interesting story about one boat from Bratislava with young Zionist Jews, and Italian fascist Fregata helped them in Aegean Sea to sail to Israel. But there were Beitars and Hapoels, on the other hand, were more like leftists, working class, and more for democracy or for freedom and so on. So actually, even Israel, since the time and even today, is kind of divided into parts of Jews who are more radical, more conservative, more nationalistic, and then Jews who are more open-minded, more liberal, and at the same time more leftist in this way. Still, it didn't help. And what Adolf Hitler managed to do was that he didn't kill Jewish nation, but he saved it because other countries in the Soviet Union didn't resist, and all of them together supported creation of State Israel on the territories of Palestinian Arabs. Result, and even Israel as a protection against their aggressive neighbors who were revengeful, of course, so USA gave them technology for A-bombs. So in this way, that was a result of Adolf Hitler policy of destroying, dividing Germany, making it one of the most democratic, multicultural, liberal nations in the world, very leftist and open-minded anarchist. Okay, cut this. Sorry, guys. Then Israel was created and they were given A-bombs and he didn't manage to have them. So in this way, this influx of Jews after the Second World War caused that State of Israel was soon to be proclaimed even without exception of the British, who said that not all the things are being created, but they didn't mind. Israel promised to keep democracy, which was still there, but the state itself was kind of not accepting these Palestinian borders. United Nations supported it, but they claimed the Jewish state originally should be only this part. White color, in this way, if you see the cursor, were only Jewish settlements before 1948 or maybe like 1946-7. So you see, mostly it's like Muslim Palestinian. According to proposal of United Nations, they should have been given bigger lands, but only these white ones. Still, Jews were not very satisfied, so each war that would be every conflict, Jews or Israeli used it to occupy larger and larger parts of Palestine that was actually independent state. Sooner or later, during these wars, Palestine lost independence, and the west bank of the river Jordan, in here next to the Dead Sea, and the Strip of Gaza, and also the capital Jerusalem, were actually occupied by Israel. And today, what you see about 2020 years ago, these are enclaves which are actually separated since times of Benjamin Netanyahu and Second Intifada, big uprising of Palestinians. It is separated by a big wall that if you want to get out of west bank of Jordan to Israeli territories for work, to school, you have to have permit, special permit. And inside there is, again, segregation, no social, uh, not social advantages that are like outside of the world. So this caused many things. But how it came to that spot? Obviously, occupation of some of these Arabic territories and existence of Israel was refused by all Arabic nations around, by Egypt, by Jordan, by Syria, and by Lebanon. Of course, including Iraq, that is further away, with support of Saudi Arabia and other Arabic countries, also called the Arabic League. These wars immediately started in 1948. The only country that helped Israel at the beginning and broke actually embargo against military was Czechoslovakia, that sent actually the worst airplanes, former Messerschmitts, now called Avia S-199. But Israel were happy to have some airplanes and they used them to fight for a couple of years. And actually, they shall never forget this help of Czechoslovakia. Many of them died, and Slovaks were sending Jews to that camp. So in this way, they managed to defend these territories and occupy some of the lands, let's say, in the north. But then, against other subsequent wars, were again in 1949, then in 1956, when British and French forces tried to occupy Suez Channel in Egypt because at the time President Nasser in Egypt wanted to nationalize it for Egypt because it was their territory. And at the time British and French army tried to send paratroopers and bank it together with Israeli. During that time they occupied large parts of the Sinai Peninsula. They actually tripled the territory of Israel. They were defeated. Then there was wars of Yom Kippur, 6 Days War, the Short War, and they actually start bombing Lebanon. And in every single war, Israel won without A bombs, despite the fact that Soviet Union provided Egypt, Syria with thousands of airplanes. Still, small Israel won. Not only because there is compulsory 3 years military service for all the population, for not only men but even for women, but also because Americans always help them. They send them some old military jets, THK, that Israeli with their excellent education, they just like upgraded them and used them. So every time they could see Arabs around, saw that Israel is winning because of help of USA. Not minding that who was it was fair or whether not, whether Israel occupied West Bank and Strip of Gaza, the Gaza Strip. So in this way, help from USA caused hate of Arabs and of Muslim world that probably USA is helping anybody but Muslims. And this is actually source of course of Muslim terrorism in 2001. In this way, as I said, Gaza Strip, West Bank of the Jordan River, and Jerusalem were being occupied. So that caused that Palestinians could see no other hope of open war and deliberation of their territories, only to be radical in the way. Complete destruction of Israel. Escape to Lebanon. There are 3 million Palestinians living in 2 million populated Lebanon, in refugee camps for generations, in tents, living there still. And of course, creating terrorism, because when you cannot defeat your enemy on the battlefield, you are so desperate, you go and you kill your kids, their wives, because they are killing your kids and your wives with Air Force strikes and missiles and so on. So for that reason, this Palestinian resistance came up to be with so-called PLO. My sme ich nazvali OOP, neznamená to okresný podnik, ale Organizácia za oslobodenie Palestíny, so Palestinian Liberation Organization. The head of this organization was Yasser Arafat here in the picture as one of the most famous terrorist leaders in this times in 1970s and 80s, and actually his scarf, kufia, became actually called Arafatka, in Slovak. Still, it was one of other organizations. Then they had also the military terrorist groups, which were called Fatah, Hamas, and Hezbollah. These three, why they were free and not only one single? Because still Palestinians, terrorists, were being supported by various Muslim countries and branches. One was supported by Arabic League and by Sunnite Muslims who were of Arabic League of Egypt and so on. That was Fatah. Then there was Hamas. Hamas was supported by more radical Wahhabist Muslims of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, and Yemen. Then the other guys was Hezbollah, who were Shia Muslims supported by Iran. Sometimes even fighting each other, especially down in Lebanon, in these refugee camps, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes organizing bomb attacks, kidnapping of airplanes, hijacking airplanes, uh, organizing suicide Black Widow bombs in Tel Aviv, in Haifa, exploding. And every single terrorist attack caused strike attacks in Lebanon and occupation of more and more Israel. Unstoppable circle of violence all the time. For that reason, I gave you also, I believe, this video about This Land Is Mine that you have in your assignment to analyze it, that whose land is it actually? And not accepting that only that it was common thing of these intifadas, uprising, burning Israeli flag. Of course, communists, Soviet Union used this support, like Cold War, proxy war. They supported Palestinian resistance, which USA stood on Israel anytime, all the time. It was, despite it was against any peace conferences in Helsinki. So this is another example that how you got like not good and bad people, but if you have like hate among them, so they can support bullies from the other side, and who is suffering? Children and kids. It's easy way how to become a terrorist when you have to carry kid from like building destroyed by, you don't know what air force, Russian or American or Syrian, but you have to carry that dead bodies of children, so you can become a terrorist very quickly. Still, the end of the Cold War became hope for a couple of years, and actually many people believed, including me, that it can be the end. When Cold War ended up and Bill Clinton proclaimed, that American president, that there should be peace, it started like to force negotiations, which led that even Israeli public start to vote election in more open-minded, this Hapoel political parties, and there were two famous politicians, that was Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. Both of these guys are in your assignment. One was president, the other was prime minister of Israel, and they accepted that let's organize. And even Yasser Arafat, despite you were organizing terrorists, didn't kill anybody. So if you make these terrorists be peaceful, we can make peace and we can give Palestine independence. For 10 years, there was belief it can happen. And as you see in this 1995, Yasser Arafat shaking hand with Yitzhak Rabin, and possible peaceful solution. They prepared autonomy for Palestine and they proclaim it. It was excellent. But you know what happened then on 11th September 2001? Uh, uh, Muslim Islamistic Wahhabist terrorists kidnapped airplanes and struck the tower skyscrapers in New York, hit the Pentagon, the Ministry of Defense, of National Defense of USA, which completely led to turn up of American policy, starting with invasion against Afghanistan, against Iraq, and against very bad policy against Palestinian Muslims, which caused actually first news that came like the twins are falling. First news on CNN and Fox News were Palestinian terrorist attack, because every time Palestinian terrorists were somewhere, nobody could remember Al Qaeda having bomb attacks in Nairobi in Kenya already in 1995. So that was actually very bad, and actually this situation completely changed this Arab-Israel conflict. That caused another bomb attacks, another Benjamin Netanyahu, these conservative Beitar political parties ruling in Israel all the time, all these regions. So that's why Israel for past 20 years is back again to scene, and Palestinians are living in very bad conditions. Okay, guys, I got 8 minutes, so it can be nice for me to show you one more thing. Actually, a couple of things is symbolically that Palestinians had no other chance to buy Semtex from Czechoslovakia, homemade explosives, just throw stones. And little kids from the childhood, they see Israeli soldiers who have to serve military, uh, being oppressing them and so on. So it's really difficult to say. Other post-colonial conflicts that are in here are mentioned according to various colonial things, and I could have told you plenty of things about it, but I'm not going to tell you. You got plenty of videos by John Green, you got some tasks about watching movies. You don't have to watch all the movies, you can just read the reviews over IMDb or SCFD, but just pick up some lists of movies and watch some John Green's videos in which many things will be explained to you. Still, you got some personalities around, maybe your people, your interviewers will give you some more information about this here. Just to summon them, other post-colonial conflicts still from British Commonwealth. Nigeria, one of the biggest countries in Africa, even today had problems with South, that is black and Christian or animistic, North, that is more Arabic, barbaric, and Muslim. Boko Haram, one of the branches of Al Qaeda, is still fighting there. In Egypt, that had long period of authoritative President Nasser that built up Egypt, but being ally of Soviet Union, thus being enemy of United States, not very successful in economy, having one of the biggest population today in Africa, and being one of the big enemies of Israel. But later on they realized it's useless, it's pointless, and rather decide to have peaceful, friendly relationships with Israel and open their country for tourism, which they rose. But still, country is Islam, is Muslim, had problems with climate changes last years, and as the only one survived Arabic Spring with pulling down this president, not Nasser, but the other one, but installing kind of military junta, that is military government in here. The British had to fight a war against Argentina in 1984 against for small islands called Malvinas and South Georgia. We call the Falkland War. Now, that was only 2 weeks war with one aircraft carrier, a couple of battleships from Argentina, and it was actually interesting because in Argentina there was military junta that had been installed by USA, but they wanted to spread the territories, occupy these British islands near Argentinian border in the seas of territorial seas. But UK had to fight them. Otherwise, probably they would have been friends with here. Margaret Thatcher, famous prime ministers at the time, had to wanted to show that Britain is still strong and can strike well and hard. France had different attitude than Britain. They didn't want to give up any of the colonies. That's why in Algeria or in Vietnam they were fighting. They caused a lot of atrocities. In Vietnam, finally they were banished from Vietnam after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Algeria, they had like great war, but really bloody. And as a reward, France opened borders for them. So it caused that 1 or maybe 10 million Algerians moved and Moroccans moved to France, living in there, including Zinedine Zidane, Thierry Henry, and many other great footballers. Mixing together, but still in 1960s, trying to oppress them, especially on the rule of President Charles de Gaulle, and oppressing kind of rights of these Muslims in here. But later on, they changed the policy, came back to secular, more open-minded philosophy, and without segregation, it's like integral part of this country, including Marseille is 1/3 of Muslim population. It's different thing from the guys who are living in the suburbs or around Paris and settle later on, or are the second, the third generation. They feel kind of alienation from the country and became be afraid of terrorists, but it's still like a couple of dozens of people, maybe hundreds of people from about maybe 15 million people who are Muslim or African origin in France. Belgium, okay, Egypt was another invasion together with United Kingdom, tried to prevent Egyptian President Nasser from nationalization of Suez Channel, but they were defeated by Soviet weapons of Egyptian army. Belgium had one colony of Congo that was divided in Congo and Zaire. Zaire is today the Democratic Republic of Congo. Belgians were really terrible. One of the worst colonial nations were Belgium. The smaller nation, the more evil they were. Read novel Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and you will understand what I'm talking about. That's why Congo remained really wild country with many groups fighting each other after they managed to defeat Belgians. Actually, Ernesto Che Guevara came to fight them. Netherlands had to fight also Indonesia in 1950, gave independence to the biggest Muslim country in the world, but not Arabic, that is Indonesia. But again, they had President Sukarno ruling there for like another 50 years maybe. The USA had plenty of conflicts of proxy wars, interventions when they installed their own loyal government, sometimes supporting undemocratic, sometimes they supported democracy in those countries, and there would be a whole list of them, including Vietnam, that you know how it ended up, in Laos, in Nicaragua against Sandinistas, in Cuba they tried but not successful, Salvador, in Iran again non-successful, the same in Libya, Kuwait again in the first war of Persian Gulf, Afghanistan and Iraq from this millennium that you were probably born a couple of years after that. But USSR was not the same thing. If you read these days that Soviet Union never attacked anybody, it's not true, guys. Afghanistan, Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, there were many of them. They supported communists and terrorists all around the world. In Cuba, they helped to install their own communist Castro's government. Cubans then sent their 100,000 soldiers to Congo and to Angola to fight South African apartheid regime. And now to tell me who's the good and who's a good guy, who's the bad guy. It was really difficult to say. Even Vietnam that defeated Americans and they became communists under Ho Chi Minh, who was actually a very peaceful leader. So they invaded their neighbor Cambodia because in Cambodia, Communist Party of Khmer Rouge, in French it means Červený Khmeri, under the dictator of Pol Pot, they killed about 2 million people wearing glasses. It was their response to Chinese a cultural revolution against bourgeoisie and middle class, and they killed millions of people. So Vietnamese Communist Army Viet Cong invaded Cambodia to defeat radical communists to install moderate communists. See, it's really difficult, ambivalent world, isn't it? Still, United Nations deployed their blue helmets with white vehicles, white airplanes and tanks in many conflicts, like in Korea, couple of times in Israel when they occupied the Golan Highlands of Syria, in Kashmir, Rwanda, but they came too late. In Cyprus, even Slovak soldiers were there. In Yugoslavia, again late, but thanks to their presence, they revealed that Serbians were killing Muslim Bosniaks in Srebrenica. 5,000 men, women, and children were killed in mass graves, and that made them fight like NATO bombing Yugoslavia, first bombing of Yugoslavia in 1994, 1995. But there was another conflict of Iraq, Iran, that two one dictatorship totalitarian regime fighting another totalitarian Muslim Islamistic regime didn't know who to support. French, USA bit supporting both of the sides. Later, both of these countries were enemies of USA and of the white and fighting each other. 1 million people died during 1980s, and Saddam Hussein became evil compared to Ayatollah Khomeini only because it deployed chemical gas weapons as the only one since Germans in the First World War. So these are crimes against humanity, guys. Actually, the time is over, so next lesson I will start with coup d'etats in Latin America and we'll move through many pictures and come to actually these times, sweet 1990s and end of dreaming. But I will be speaking a lot, guys, and the other lesson will be about Czechoslovakia, Slovakia. So I'm glad that we have these lessons in here. So that's all from me, guys, and stay negative in tests, positive in mind, and we'll see when are we going to go back to school. My guess is that you will come back to school maybe in June, perhaps. Okay, bye bye. See you next lesson.